What's up, Otakuans? I hope you all are having a peaceful Memorial Day surrounded by the people you care for and care for you. It's your host, David, and I'm back this week to bring you part 2 of Goblin Slayer Light Novel, Volume 1. If you haven't already, check out part 1 of this review, link above, and without further ado, let's get back into it. Last week, we left off where Goblin Slayer and Priestess are met by the unexpected visitors, a small adventuring party made up of High Elf Archer, Dwarf Shaman, and Lizardman Priest. They've been sent from their respective lands to seek out a solution to an exceptionally large goblin that's located in the Elven lands. Due to political disagreements, no large army from any of the surrounding lands want to even touch the subject of sending troops on the foreign soil. The group quickly learns that Goblin Slayer's moniker is not just a nickname, but his way of life. This is the way. The world may be in turmoil due to the current Demon King, but the only thing important to Goblin Slayer is protecting the weak and helpless from the little demons called goblins. Since the quest is indeed a goblin quest, Goblin Slayer accepts, and through some convincing from Priestess, Goblin Slayer, Priestess, and the 3 visitors form a temporary party to resolve the goblin issue. Chapter 6, Travel Companions. 3 days have now passed since we last saw our protagonist. The 5 adventurers are now sitting beneath the stars, exchanging stories and sharing their food and drink. This chapter goes pretty much the same way the anime continues from episode 3. Once our adventurers began to drink, personalities come out more and more. We learn why Goblin Slayer never removes his helmet due to him wanting to always be ready in case of an attack. Of course, this bothers the elf. We also learn more about the Lizardman's background as a Lizardman priest and get to see his newfound love for cheese. All the while, Goblin Slayer is diligently prepping for the mission they are soon about to embark on. Another key event during the harmless exchange is the High Elf's discovery of a magic scroll that Goblin Slayer is keeping. We find out the origins of the magic scroll, and due to how valuable a scroll can be, not every scroll is the same. Throughout time, magic scrolls became a thing of the past where adventurers now just sell them when found for some sort of financial compensation due to the fact that wizards in the party completely make scrolls obsolete. It's also weird for adventurers to actually keep those scrolls. On top of that, Goblin Slayer refuses to tell everyone what spell his scroll holds, just in case a goblin interrogates them. You can see how little Goblin Slayer truly trusts the group. The final talking points from this chapter began with the discussion of what Orkbog, or the dwarven counterpart Beard Cutter, come from. We find out that these are the names for a legendary sword apparently forged by the dwarves, reason why they lay claim to its name, but wielded by the elves, who feel they lay claim more to the name because of this. Apparently when this sword grew nearer to goblins, it would grow blue with power. Lastly, they discuss where they believe goblins even come from. Depending on the background of the adventurer, the story always changes. We see that Goblin Slayer believes that they come from the moon, and the reason why? His sister told him, and she's never wrong. He then falls asleep shortly after, possibly from drinking too much, or maybe he's starting to loosen up. The rest decide to take watch for the rest of the night. Chapter 7, Goblin Slayer. Our chapter begins at the goblin nest smack in the middle of a large field made of white stone. The closing scene from episode 3 shows our adventurers surveying the nest from afar, and then High Elf Archer taking out the goblin guards and watchdog. We learn here that a goblin's nest with a watchdog means that they have plenty of time and resources. Basically, business is good. High Elf questions the time of day they chose to attack, where Goblin Slayer lets her know that late evening for them will be early morning for the goblins. Once all the goblins were taken out, we receive some dialogue from Goblin Slayer that the goblins seem to be diligent but afraid. Very out of character. This does make Goblin Slayer wonder, but High Elf shrugs it off to them being simply too close to the elf villages, making those goblins nervous. We next see when High Elf finds out she must put goblin guts all over her body to hide her smell from the goblins. Now she finally understands why Goblin Slayer's armor is always so dirty. This begins in the opening scene of episode 4. Immediately after walking in, Goblin Slayer goes to work searching for traps while Lizardman Priest comments how the nest appears to be a simple temple. Note, High Elf Archer changes from her great bow to a smaller one. Soon, Elf finds a newer noisemaker alarm, which raises Goblin Slayer's concerns. He notes the absence of totem poles makes it weird that they're finding something so sophisticated as this trap. The next scene follows the anime where the dwarf shaman identifies the goblin's dwelling is in the hallway to the left, while to the right leads somewhere else. Goblin Slayer decides to go to the right and states it'll be too late when they ask why not left. The adventurers are soon met by the smells of filth, to which Goblin Slayer says you'll get used to it. Then they find a rotting door that leads to a room filled with excrement, bones with bits of flesh still hanging, and even corpses. In the midst of this, you could barely make out a dismangled body of an elf. Half her body had been mutilated, while the left still bears some resemblance of the beauty of her people. The scene discusses the new goblin adventures in every way you can imagine. The high elf couldn't hold back the tears of the torturing of her fellow elf. The dwarf stood stoic yet horrified, while the lizard priest just disgusted. When the half-dead elf muttered, "Kill," the priestess had held hope that she could still save this unfortunate soul. Everyone rushed to help the elf except Goblin Slayer. He instead slowly walked towards the elf, sword in hand. Priestess immediately had flashbacks of Goblin Slayer mercy-killing wizard since she was poisoned and suffering. She rushed to stop Goblin Slayer from what she felt he was about to do, yelling for him to stop. He didn't stop, and he only replied, "I came here with one purpose, to slay goblins." Then he proceeded to kill a goblin that was holding a poisoned dagger hidden in a pile of trash next to the elf. No one had noticed except for him. Priestess finally understood what it meant by "let it be your own decision." Chapter 8, Goblin Slaying. The next chapter begins where the last leaves off. Goblin Slayer had just killed the hidden goblins, saving the captured elf. Lizard Priest has provided an escort for the elf prisoner back to the forest. Same as the anime, he casts a spell using a few small fangs he pulls from his pouch. We learn this is his dragon-toothed warrior, another miracle he can perform, capable of fighting a few goblins if needed. High Elf then notices they no longer smell the rotten stench even though they haven't left the room. Goblin Slayer finds a map he figures fallen from the party, used to navigate among the garbage in the room. He confirms their pathing and throws the knapsack at the elf. This scene follows the anime where the priestess protests, but the High Elf archer agrees. Dwarf remarks on Goblin Slayer's behavior, saying he's a real piece of work. Though they all agree, you must be a little crazy to follow this line of work. The party moves forward, running into a few goblin patrols on the way. High Elf archer taking out many of them with her arrows, but if that fails, Goblin Slayer always swoops in. When they reach their destinations, they stopped in the room before and discuss how many miracles each have. Note, High Elf is very quiet and down the whole time, so Dwarf offers her to drink to help loosen her nerves. Though Goblin Slayer tells her sternly not to fill her stomach, he assures the group that he doesn't want anyone to feel forced to continue to move forward. He just wants them to be in their best condition. High Elf assures him she can handle this. She's a ranger, and after what they just witnessed, there's no way she can turn around. The only thing left that changes is the party notes the illustration of the battles from the Age of the Gods on the white stone walls. It shows a depiction of the creation of the world. Then the group overlooks the view from below. At least over 50 goblins spread out. The sight of the goblins reignited High Elf's rage. Then they proceeded to use the dwarf stupor and priestess's silence as you saw them in the anime. Lizardman, High Elf, and Goblin Slayer proceeded to slit the throats of the goblins below. High Elf managed to get all her frustration out, but soon it was taking a toll on her. Following her companion's lead, she began using the Goblin Slayer's weapons to kill them instead of her own. A bit less, it took almost 30 minutes to finish the job. Worn out, the adventurers began to move forward to the next room to further in to finish off any survivors. The group was stopped in their tracks by a large thump. A large creature with a blue and black body emerged from a dark hallway. Horns grew from its forehead and its breath assaulted them with every breath it took. The only word heard in this moment were uttered by the High Elf archer. Ogre. Chapter 9, The Strong One. The ogre menaces over the party, assaulting them with his breath. It speaks about the useless goblins and how it wondered why it got so quiet. He then remarks how this party is different from the forest dweller from earlier. His bloodlust was thick and the party was ready for a fight. The first to speak was Goblin Slayer, confused because he's not a goblin. This angers the ogre, thinking that Goblin Slayer is trying to mock him. The novel then speaks about the known feats of ogres. Once a knight with a sturdy shield died when trying to block an ogre's attack, only to find her own shield in her forehead. A great warrior challenged the ogre to a 100-day battle, but even after, ogre never took a scratch, and the warrior, after months of fighting, fell exhausted. Even a great wizard was outspelled by an ogre. These creatures even give silver rank adventurers a hard time. We learned this one was even granted an army by the demon general. Furious, he creates a blue fireball and throws it at the adventurers. Everyone scatters except for his priestess, who rushes forward and summons a protection miracle to stop the fireball. The heat from the flame licks and burns her as she tries to hold out, chanting a second protection miracle. Unlike in the anime, the protection spell doesn't stop the fireball, but significantly reduces the heat so they all can survive. We learn here about overcast, something that happens when someone says a spell more times than they can handle. She apologizes to Goblin Slayer, but he assures her that she saved them. The rest of the party conducts the assault. Lizard Priest summons a dragon-tooth warrior, then follows up with a prayer to create a weapon for the Bone Warrior. As seen in the anime, the ogre takes Goblin Slayer out with one swing of his warhammer, reminding him he's no mere goblin. We also find out that ogre can heal himself. In the midst of battle, we hear Dwarf wishing he had learned Firebolt instead of his Stone Blast, as he's running out of spells. Though on the ropes, they all agree the last thing they can do is retreat. We come back to the priestess, and she is slowly bringing Goblin Slayer back to consciousness. He's badly injured, and he can barely see. He asks for a healing and a stamina potion from priestess. Goblin Slayer acknowledges he is in extreme pain, and his head felt funny due to a large dent in his helmet. If he could feel pain, though, that means he's still alive. There's a small exchange between Goblin Slayer and priestess when he requests his bag and removes the scroll. She begins to contest the decision, but he assures her this is the best way. This is the way. He jumps back into the fight after downing the potions and immediately announces he has a plan. Though this man looks to only have a few toes out of the grave, High Elf knew if anyone can come up with a way to win, it's him. The ogre readies another fireball, knowing the priestess was all out of miracles, and launches it at the adventurers. Goblin Slayer takes this moment to rush out and enact his plan. A roar, a flash, then silence as we return to the ogre's perspective. He could feel himself floating and then hitting the ground. He was confused. Maybe the recoil from the spell threw him back. His mind wandered until he was at a loss of breath, and he could see his own legs, no longer attached. He had been cut in half. Goblin Slayer walks towards him and explains the scroll he has contained the spell gate, and this gate was connected to the bottom of the ocean. We find out here that the job Witch spoke about earlier was a job to connect the scroll to the ocean. The final scene of the chapter closely follows the anime. Following the ogre's defeat, the adventurers leave the nest, and the elven carriage was already outside waiting for them. They're exhausted, and they immediately fall inside the carriage. Later, after most of the party have fallen asleep, High Elf Archer asks Priestess, is he always like this, to which she responds the same way that we saw. What we don't hear about or see clearly is though the Goblin Slayer armor and weapons are badly damaged, he had received some remedial care from Lizard Priests, who perform a refresh miracle, but it doesn't negate accumulated fatigue. According to Priestess, his miracle was even more powerful than her own minor heal. This is just simply the difference between a porcelain and a silver ring. High Elf Archer, looking back at the events so far, acknowledges how good of a person Goblin Slayer may be, but she still can't stand him. He has no idea what a real adventure is, and she vows to herself that she will show him. Interlude, the hero. During this interlude, again we are looking at a conversation from someone else's perspective. We find out that this individual is just a new adventurer with the same upbringing as Priestess growing up in the temple. At 15, they left and also joined the Adventure Guild. This adventurer takes a Goblin Slayer quest on their first day alone, and recounts their story of braving the nest. As they continue to make their way, slaying all the goblins in their way, they happen upon the boss, one of the 16 generals of hell. They engage the enemy, believing them to be a large goblin who also uses spells. The adventurer mentions that they used at least 5 to 6 spells on their own, until they became too tired to decide to end the battle with their sword. Unfortunately, it immediately broke, but luckily they found another sword buried in the pedestal nearby. Thinking it was an old rusty sword, anything's better than nothing, right? They were surprised to see how shiny it was when it was drawn. With this new weapon, the adventurer easily slices the goblin in two, and the boss states that even though they've won, the other 15 will hunt them down. Taking a step back, we find out that the ancient spirits of evil have returned, and he was in fact one of the generals, and the sword was actually the Sword of Light. This female adventurer may turn out to be the legendary hero. Chapter 10, Dozing. The next chapter is where the anime and the light novel start to have a few changes, specifically in the order, so I will begin to cover them in the order that they appear in the novel. The opening scene is the same as we see from episode 10 from the anime, from Goblin Slayer perspective, thinking back to the incident of 10 years ago. We learned about the argument between him and Cowgirl that caused her to leave without him. We also learned he had always wanted to be an adventurer, but maybe even one day becoming a platinum rank. But he lets go of that dream to stay back on the farm to help his sister, because he knows she surely must have sacrificed her dreams to do the same for him. After his argument, his sister reprimands him for making the little girl cry. She tells him, "You're supposed to protect girls." His sister was wise in his eyes. When they got home, she made him his favorite, her stew. And even though he asked for seconds, thirds, and fourths, he no longer remembers the taste, because that was the last time he had it before they came. The following scene also continues from episode 10 in the anime, where he awakes on the farm and remembers he doesn't have his gear since he dropped it off. We see the interaction he has between Cowgirl and her uncle. Though uncle may not like him very much, he still cares about him and his well-being and suggests he take some time to rest. We see Goblin Slayer already knows that the uncle doesn't like him, but of course this doesn't matter much. Cowgirl begins to set off to the city so that she can do her regular deliveries, and Goblin Slayer, against Cowgirl's wishes, accompanies her and even pushes the cart. We also find that it has been about 3 days since he has returned, and he's still not up to form. He soon becomes out of breath and sweating just from pushing the cart. They engage in idle talk, and Cowgirl even brings up Priestess, to which he brushes off because it's just simply of no importance. He says that being there pushing the cart with her is nicer than killing goblins, and this little bit makes her happy. After guild, the two part ways for a bit while Cowgirl takes care of a few responsibilities. Oddly enough, we see the Goblin Slayer and Spearman have a brief talk that actually goes over pretty well. We know up to this point Spearman is jealous of Goblin Slayer because he finds himself to be superior, but Guild Girl only has eyes for Goblin Slayer. But during this convo, Spearman has no idea he's talking to the Goblin Slayer, simply because he's just not wearing his normal armor and helmet, which soon appears and leads Spearman off, but not before indicating to Goblin Slayer and the reader that she recognizes him. Right after this Goblin Slayer receives his armor and gear back from the workshop, where we find out there that the Adventure Guild also doubles as a place of commerce for the adventurers. It seems Goblin Slayer frequently uses this shop specifically for armor, and he maybe have been the one who found the original scroll for him, since he's asking for him to find another. The apprentice boy asks the owner why he doesn't upgrade his armor or his weapons. His response: "That is a man who knows his business." The next scenes follow episode 5, where Goblin Slayer meets up with other characters, including Priestess, who we find had just received a promotion from porcelain to obsidian due to her ordeal with the ogre. Goblin Slayer still doesn't know what an ogre is. Leaving from the workshop and guild lobby to help unload the cart, he then runs into Hive Elf, Lizard Priest, and Dwarf Shaman, where Lizard Priest requests some more cheese, and High Elf embarrassingly asks Goblin Slayer to join their party and continue adventuring with them, to which he responds, he'll think about it. We then return to episode 10, where he notices a few warriors sparring in the plaza behind the guild. One of the scouts from the heavily armored warriors party, and another who's a rookie warrior who he had heard had been headed to the sewers. Goblin Slayer ends up speaking to a woman in the knight's armor, who he notes is also part of the armored warriors party. They discuss how they ended up training him and the importance of this training. Soon Guild Girl appears and discusses the guild's need to create a facility to train these rookie warriors. She also mentions she hopes that Goblin Slayer will one day join the instructors and lead the adventuring in the past, poking fun at the fact it took so long to recover from his last adventure. She then informs him that she would not be giving him new requests for at least a month, so that he is forced to heal. This conversation is just between the two, unlike in the anime. Cowgirl then appears and they return home. The chapter closes out with a sentimental scene between Cowgirl and Goblin Slayer, where Cowgirl finds Goblin Slayer staring up at the stars and asks what he's thinking about, as seen at the end of episode 10. He responds, "The future." This leaves them both silent, staring up at the sky. She seemed to understand exactly what he meant, as she always does, even though he's a man of very few words. They exchange a few more embarrassing statements, and suddenly Cowgirl pulls Goblin Slayer down to lie in her lap and stare up at the stars and her eyes. She tells him that they have the time to think things over, to which he responds, "Our time?" and she confirms. This puts him at ease. He closes his eyes, even though all he could still see was her. That night, they had stew. Then the narrator tells us that almost a month has passed. The battle between the adventurers and the evil spirits raged on until it was suddenly over. The little girl from the interlude followed the instructions from the legendary sword and eventually slayed the Demon King. She became the 16th platinum adventurer in history. We all see this play out in the anime spanning from episodes 5 to 12. Though none of this mattered to Goblin Slayer. All he cared for was the weather, the animals, the crops on the farm, and the people around him. Life was good, until he found what he had dreaded since the day 10 years ago, trailing mud and excrements, accompanied with small footprints. Chapter 11, A Party of Adventurers. This chapter follows along with exactly what we saw in episode 11 of the anime. Goblin Slayer does his best to try to convince Cowgirl to run away as soon as possible. He discusses with her exactly what he found and the danger it will pose. She asks him, full of hope, whether or not he can stop them. He tells her no. If it were a cave, maybe he could manage, but not in this open large area. He explains that the enemy is a lord, which means that the scale would be larger than anything he's ever dealt with. They didn't have the numbers, nor did they have the strength. He was no hero. She then says that she will not leave because she knows that he won't leave either. Nothing he says will convince her otherwise, because even if she left, it would mean leaving her whole life behind to be destroyed. He understands, and he only responds that he would do what he can. As he leaves, he remembers his sister's words. He's supposed to protect all girls, so he would do what he can. We also see that the uncle had heard most of the conversation. Nothing Goblin Slayer could say would alleviate his anger. He tells him he will try. The next scene again plays out the same exact way, where Goblin Slayer appears at the Adventuring Guild while it is still bustling due to the end of the Evil Spirits War. Goblin Slayer walks to the middle of the lobby and announces to everyone he has a request. He gives the details of the impending danger and his target. Knowing the history of adventures and Goblin Quest, it came to no surprise that no one immediately volunteered. Everyone who knows how dangerous goblins were knew what a horror of that size is capable of. At first, everyone was against it until Spearman spoke up. Though it may seem he was against it at first, he soon realized that he is trying to help. He tells Goblin Slayer that they are adventurers, and if you want something, you have to put it in a formal request. Goblin Slayer then takes his opportunity to lay it all out on the table. He is willing to give up anything and everything. The only thing left out of the anime here is Spearman asking Goblin Slayer if he's willing to give up Guild Girl. Goblin Slayer lets him know that Guild Girl isn't his to give up. The only thing he isn't willing to give up is his life. That's not his to give. Spearman then quickly accepts the quest, starting the domino effect. High Elf, Lizard Priest, and Dwarf Shaman take this time to also offer their weapons, and then Witch. The last straw was Guild Girl suddenly appearing, announcing that the guild is now offering an emergency quest. This convinces the rest of the adventurers in the guild to also offer their weapons. The last scene shows Priestess appearing right next to Goblin Slayer, as expected, happy that it all worked out. That day, for the first time, there was no shortage of adventurers ready to take on a Goblin quest. Chapter 12, Over the Goblin's Hill. This chapter was probably my favorite, not just because of the final battle, but because we see this chapter all from the perspective of the Goblin Lord. It starts as the Goblin Lord is preparing for the invasion. He's going over the different moving parts of their upcoming raid, starting with the meat shields. He cackled at the thought of the adventurers losing their will and falling into despair at the sight of the human shields. He would cause them to hesitate and give the goblins the advantage. We learn how the Goblin Lord truly hates humans, thinking back on how much harm they have done to his kind, including attacking his nest and abandoning him in the wilderness because he was too young. This is an awesome callback to earlier in the novel, where Goblin Slayer warns Priestess about allowing the younger goblins to live, knowing it would just allow them to grow their hatred, learn, and eventually lead their own nests. His plan is to first start at the farm, steal the livestock for food, and the cowgirl to bolster their numbers. The farm will serve as a beachhead to attack the city and kill all the adventurers. Once they have taken the city, soon he would create the Goblin Kingdom in its place. The Goblin Lord harvested the anger for all of his people. It was time. We then continue from where we left off from episode 11. As the Goblin Lord begins his engagement, he begins to smell something sweet. One by one, his shield bearers began to collapse. Then he suddenly realized this is magic. Soon adventurers began to appear and the battle began. Though his shamans were successful at hitting a few adventurers, others quickly replaced those fallen adventurers. The enemy was ignoring the goblins and instead retrieving and retreating with the meat shields. Soon they were met by arrows from a tree not too far away, sent by an elf. When the goblin archers returned fire, she quickly disappeared. His troops were being overrun by these organized adventurers and the lingering effects of that super spell. The enemy adventurers and the goblin troops now met in the center of the battlefield, which prevented either side from using their spells. Though the goblins had no qualms with using their companions as meat shields, they also realized that they can't allow the numbers of these shields to get too low. From this initial exchange, both sides had its own losses. The adventurers still had that overwhelming presence. Of course, in a straight contest, the adventurer will always come out on top, but with the Goblin Slayer's tips, set ambushes, watch out for meat shields, don't attack using magic, save and use your weapons, and stay low, and never allow the enemy to get behind you, it made this all the much easier. Many of the major battles match what we saw in the anime, so not much to discuss. Mounted goblins, hobgoblins, reinforcements, goblin champions, reinforcements. The horde threw everything it had the adventurers to very little success. The scene then transitions when Spearman asks where Goblin Slayer may be. Now we return to the Goblin Lord. He is bewildered by what he just witnessed. He is now running away from the battlefield, thinking to himself what he should do next. As soon as he knew defeat was imminent, he fled. Now all he can hear is the sounds of weapons clanking, screams, and spells being cast. How could this surprise attack fail so soundly? His horde was lost, but the only thing that truly mattered is his own survival. He will return to the nest and use the captured girls to start anew. He reminisces back to his first victim, the adventurer who had spared him because he was just a child. He learned how compliant humans became when you hit them in the head with a rock. Next, he learned how to utilize weapons and armors, and followed the adventurer's example when leading this horde. Through time and experience, he is now even a match for a human warrior. His thoughts are interrupted by a cold, mechanical voice. Goblin Slayer had knew this was the plan to run, so he went around to cut off his escape. Episode 12 is where this final battle begins. The two engaged in battle that seemed pretty even, but the difference in strength and the wounds from not even a month before became very apparent. After one exchange, the Goblin Lord knocks Goblin Slayer off his feet, splitting his shield nearly in half, and then again with another exchange, leaving the shield soundly split in two, and a gash in Goblin Slayer's arm. A weakened Goblin Slayer tries to stand, but he finds that his sword is broken, and the Goblin Lord now begins to see his victory nigh. He, at least in the end, could have revenge for his fallen troops. He would cut off the hands and feet and torture this Goblin Slayer to death. The thought of this made him laugh with greed, and he moved towards the adventurer. As he goes for the final blow, it is stopped, not once but twice. He soon feels his bone crackling, as if he was sandwiched between two invisible walls. He soon could hear the prayers of the priestess. No matter how many insults and threats he threw at her, she never stopped, even though she looked so frail and innocent. He switched his tactics again and began to beg for forgiveness. He promised to never do anything like this again and that he would move peacefully into the woods. It wouldn't be the first time he's convinced a female adventurer to spare his life through a show of repentance. He again remembers back to the female adventurer who spared him, and soon as her back was turned, he murdered her. He took joy from the memory of her begging for help as he stabbed her to death. He is soon shaken from his blissful dream by the voice of Goblin Slayer again. Goblin Slayer returns to his feet, holding the broken sword, slowly walking towards Goblin Lord. Goblin Slayer then pushes the sword into Goblin Lord's neck. Even though it can no longer cut or pierce, it could still crush. As she crushes the windpipe, he begins to mock Goblin Lord's Lord title. He then tells him that he is, but Goblin Lord never heard his final words. Goblin Lord's last thoughts were, "What? What are you?" With the Goblin Lord dead, Priestess now uses her remaining miracle to save Goblin Slayer, even though he had instructed her to use all three of her miracles to crush the Goblin Lord. She then chastises him for being so reckless and not thinking about his own safety. After a small exchange, he admits he only behaved so recklessly because he trusted her. This made her smile. Her thoughts then wandered to her first companions who died, the adventurers who had died or are dying from tonight's battle, and all the goblins that have been killed. And then the Goblin Lord that was killed right in front of her eyes. She now fully understands the weight that this man that now leans on her for support truly has carried so far. Chapter 13, The Fate of an Adventurer. The name of this chapter definitely produced some chills. Looking back at Chapter 1, The Fate of the Adventurers, this title and chapter did really well to wrap it all up in a nice bow. The chapter begins where the second half of episode 12 begins. This is post-battle, and now all the adventurers are back at the guild celebrating their victory and also remembering the ones they lost. The tally, 100 goblins that included shamans, champions, hobgoblins, and goblin riders, and one goblin lord. Many scenes match the anime, but what I do want to draw attention to is the conversation between Priestess and Goblin Slayer. In the anime, Priestess questions Goblin Slayer about giving her the go, where he assures her that it's for her defeating the Goblin Lair, while in the light novel she only asks if he is okay with money or needs anything. He explained he is okay. He's already compensated everyone that he promised, including the witch and spearmen, but she knows that he doesn't make much money from just hunting goblins. He adds not to worry. The guild is footing the bill. This exchange is lighthearted and doesn't concern Priestess as much as shown in anime. When Priestess asks why Goblin Slayer chose to ask for help instead of just posting a quest, she wonders to herself whether all the theatrics were needed. This actually makes Goblin Slayer think for a moment. Then he lets her know it's because when it happened to him, no one came. If you recall, the norm is for adventurers to ignore Goblin quests, and only the takers were newbies. Maybe he felt he had the best chance by putting himself in a vulnerable position. When Priestess asks to see his face, Goblin Slayer never questions her. Again, in the light novel, the Sword Maiden thing did not happen, so she had not up to this point had an opportunity to see his face. Once he removes it, she blushes and responds that he looks ... braver this way. This is a great callback to when he first stepped off with this new party. He refused to even remove his helmet, even to eat, to now he's willing to remove his helmet in front of a room full of people he doesn't truly know. The final segment of this book is actually something that is spread out between the beginnings of episode 2 and 4 and finishes at the end of episode 12. The narrator again steps outside the story and talks of a time long ago where gods of light, order, and destiny faced off against the gods of darkness, chaos, and chance, for whom would control the world through the roll of a dice. Soon they grew bored of this and instead created many creatures of both light and darkness, in which they would use like playthings. Soon a particular adventurer steps onto the game board, and even though there's nothing special about him, nor is he destined to save the world or make any significant changes, all the gods like him. Even though he is just a pawn like any other piece you can find on the board, he's different. Even the gods did not know what his fate would be. But he continues on. Alright, there you have it. That is all of Goblin Slayer Light Novel Volume 1. I appreciate you all taking the time to enjoy this content, and I hope that I see you all again next week. Peace.